everyone. I'm David Tunick, president of the IFPDA, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's IFPDA Print Month presentation, focusing on the remarkable Goncourt brothers, one of whom you see behind me. It's an etching by Bracamon from my personal collection. In preparation, I came across this statement from an Encyclopedia Britannica entry on the Goncourt brothers. Quote, their novels are hardly stories at all, but picture galleries hung with pictures of the momentary aspects of the world, end quote. The brothers were both etchers and writers. You're going to hear about that remarkable intersection of two distinct disciplines and why it is important to all of us who are print specialists. Some logistics before I introduce Cabell on to you. We will leave time at the end for a Q&A session. Feel free throughout to post your questions by clicking on the Q&A button, usually found by dragging your cursor down to the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will see your questions. We'll try to get to all that come in, but we have more than 250 people registered today. So if we do not get to yours due to the large number of viewers today, we apologize. Cabell On, whom we are about to meet, currently serves as president of the Association of Print Scholars, an august group that is the IFPDA's partner today in bringing this discussion to you. Cabell is a New York-based art historian and journalist. She received her doctorate from Harvard and holds an MA from the Courtauld and an MA from the Bard Graduate Center. She earned her undergraduate degree at Wellesley. A specialist in 18th-century French art, she also writes on the history of the art market and on contemporary artists who challenge and reframe the old masters. Her bylines have appeared in the Art Newspaper, Observer, and Master Drawings, among other publications. Cabell On, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, David. Hi, I'm Cabell, the current president of APS. APS is a nonprofit organization that supports interdisciplinary approaches to the history of printmaking. Every print month, we're delighted to partner with IFPDA and bring you programs such as this one today. In addition to webinars, we sponsor working groups, research grants, and have a robust listserv. Membership is open to anyone whose research focuses on printmaking, and you can find out more about us at printscholars.org. So today's program will be a virtual book launch, The Goncourt Brothers in the Language of Etching, authored by Rachel Skokowski, and which will be published by Oxford University Press in November. Rachel is the director of galleries and curator of the Janet Turner Print Museum at California State University, Chico. She received her PhD from University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Her research on 18th and 19th century print culture has been published in 19th century French Studies, the Australian Journal of French Studies, and more. Moderating the conversation today, we're delighted to have Laurel Garber, who is the Park Family Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the PMA. A specialist in 19th century French graphic arts, Laurel received her PhD from Northwestern, and her most recent projects at the Philadelphia Museum of Art include Wanda Gog, Mary Cassett, and Emma Amos. Just a quick housekeeping note, the format of the program will be as follows. Rachel will begin with a 20-minute presentation, followed by a conversation between Rachel and Laurel, and followed thereafter by Q&A. So as David said, please add your questions during the conversation via the Q&A button below. I'm delighted to turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Cabell and David, and to IFPDA and APS for having me here today. I'm going to share my screen and start this presentation. I am so excited to share more about my book, which is coming out with Oxford University Press next month. And the underlying aim of this book is to showcase how printmaking offers an exciting opportunity to reorient our understanding of the relationship between art and writing in 19th century France, identifying new intersections between prints, process, and prose. And it does so through the work of an unusual duo, the Goncourt brothers. Edmond and Jules were creative collaborators and prolific writers, co-authoring 8 historical and art historical works, as well as 6 novels. They were significant collectors of 18th century French drawings and Japanese art, and you might also know them from their journal, a diary stretching nearly 50 years that provides a wealth of insight into 19th century France as well as their creative process. And finally, they were also etchers, making 93 etchings in total from 1859 until Jules' death in 1870, 10 by Edmond and 83 by Jules. And their ex libris here on the right really points to the centrality of their work as etchers. One hand indicates the initials E and J, signaling their close collaboration. Yet the hand holds not a pen, but an etching needle topped with their initial G. And the ex libris was etched by Jules himself after a design by their close friend, lithographer and caricaturist Gavarni. So etching was central to the Goncourts' creative identity, but I was surprised to find almost no mention of their work as etchers in either art historical or literary scholarship as I began this research. And I believe this neglect stems in part from our modern preference for original rather than reproductive prints, as most of the brothers' etchings reproduce works by other artists. And this, I think, has made it easier to dismiss their prints as copies, a kind of hobby, maybe a distraction, a pleasant one from their primary career as writers. Yet they were deeply invested in the process and techniques of etching, far beyond that of a hobbyist. Jules reworked and reprinted his etchings. We have this fabulous Fonatire BAT print here on the right where you can see his detailed notes to the printer at the bottom. And they also wrote passionately about their experiences making etchings. This journal entry from February 17th, 1859 is the moment that they printed their first etching at Auguste Delatre's workshop, and it captures, I think, perfectly the suspense and drama of the printmaking process. This moment when your hands tremble to grasp that sheet of paper, still damp, bearing a more or less viable line. And their experience printing in Delatre's workshop is also significant because it shows their personal involvement with the larger movement of the French etching revival. Delatre was at the epicenter of the revival, a movement in the 1860s where artists, writers, and printers joined forces to promote etching as a cutting-edge print medium. And you can see here this fabulous image of the headquarters of the Société des Aquafortistes, the Etching Society, that was formed in 1862 with the Goncourt as founding members. So the revival not only encouraged technical and artistic experimentation with etching, but it also offered the opportunity to theorize printmaking in new ways and to reimagine its place in the traditional hierarchy of artistic media. By the first half of the 19th century, etching found itself increasingly competing for attention among a variety of new art forms. We have lithography here on the top left. Ooh, going back. Photography in this amazing caricature by Daumier in the center, as well as etching's traditional rival, the other intaglio print form, engraving. And you have Félix Buaux's fantastic burial of the engraving burin here on the right. So the revival sought to regenerate French etching by presenting it as a superior alternative to these other types of printed images. Through the close involvement of authors and critics, the revival also created new opportunities for exchange between the visual arts and writing. Writers such as Charles Baudelaire, Théophile Gautier, and Philippe Berti penned often cited prefaces and articles promoting etching. However, as I discovered in my research, out of the many authors writing about etching, only the Goncourt brothers had a sustained first-hand experience with etching in the 1860s, offering a really unique opportunity to explore the relationship between writing and printmaking in their work. So for the remainder of this presentation, I want to introduce 3 areas of focus within the book. First, the Goncourts etched illustrations for their art historical work on 18th century French art, which allow us to nuance the rhetoric around reproductive printmaking as translation. And secondly, the relationship between etching and writing in the 19th century novel, specifically the metaphor of the artist as monkey and its implications for reevaluating the stakes of artistic and literary labor. And finally, a brief peek into the afterlives of the brothers' etchings with this portrait by Bracquemont that we saw on David's wall. So from 1859 to 70, the brothers published 11 monographs about 14 different 18th century artists, collectively titled The Art of the 18th Century. And this was the first art historical work to focus on French Rococo artists such as Watteau, Fragonard, Chardin, Boucher. And alongside their text, the brothers made 38 etched illustrations reproducing 18th century artworks, primarily drawings, and many from their own collection. And while these serve an obvious didactic purpose for the reader, I argue that they served a deeper purpose for Edmond and Jules as writers. Their text is remarkable for its descriptions of the artistic process, imagining the actual moment of making. We have this quotation on the right here about Fragonard's red chalk drawings that not only recreates the movement of his hand, but imagines the tactile experience of his manipulation of the chalk between his thumb and index finger. And this striking attention to process, I argue, stems directly from the brothers' reproductive etchings, which gave them an embodied phenomenological understanding of the act of making. And etching also allowed them to explore the creative possibilities of reproductive printmaking. They followed in the footsteps of 18th century artists like François Boucher, whose famous etchings after Watteau really captured the spirit of the original drawings. And the brothers also experimented with 18th century techniques like crayon manner that you can see here center, which was invented to better capture the effects of drawing in print. And you can see the use of this roulette wheel on the right in Jules' etching and the sort of illusionistic effect that it enables. And the brothers' reproductive etchings allow us to pull out an alternative strain in the rhetoric of the etching revival. So much critical attention has been paid to the revival's promotion of the original print, yet a closer reading of contemporary sources shows that etching was also frequently praised for its ability to act as a form of translation, as in this wonderful quote from Delacroix. Precisely because of its much touted directness and proximity to the artist's hand, copying through etching becomes an additive, generative process that can reveal as much about the reproductive printmaker as it does about the original artist. And we can really see the creativity inherent in this act of translation in these two versions of Latour's self-portrait, where Jules is really experimenting with different techniques and effects in etching. We have stippling on the left, we have this line work on the right, really trying to better capture this uncanny lifelike effect of Latour's famous pastels. So for the Goncourts art historians, this working and reworking makes visible the cognitive value of copying. And as reproductive prints, these works demonstrate the unique capacity of the etching medium as translation. Jules' etchings capture traces of both his and Latour's gestures, layering their artistic hands and identities. So if etching served a clear purpose for the Goncourts art historians, what role did it play in their work as novelists? Interestingly, they did not illustrate any of their novels with their own prints, but I believe etching left its mark in other ways. And I want to focus here in particular on the brothers' 1867 artist novel, Manette Salomon, which I'll talk about in relation to this etching here. So although they're not widely read today, the brothers' novels were at the forefront of 19th century literary movements of realism and naturalism, presenting unflinching portraits of contemporary society. They were widely read and popular at the time. Van Gogh even depicted their novels Manette Salomon and Germanie La Certeux in this version of his portrait of Dr. Gachet. And Manette Salomon in particular was the first novel to depict the art world of the 1840s and 50s, following a group of artists throughout their careers as they explore styles from Orientalism to Barbizon plein air painting. And as an artist novel, it provides the perfect means to interrogate this relationship between art and literature. So why the monkey? One of the fundamental metaphors explored in the novel, as well as by artists from the 16th century onwards, is the singe peintre, or the monkey artist. The depiction of artists as monkey offers not only the opportunity for humorous self-reflection, but also an interrogation of the imitative aspects of art, whether that's the recreation of the natural world or the aping of other artists in the name of tradition, as you can see in Granville's blindfolded monkey here, who's followed by this sort of train of disciples. And in Menat Salomon, there is an actual monkey. One of the artists has a pet monkey named Vermilion, who loves to steal feathers from chickens, dip them in the gutter, and paint with them. But when the monkey does paint, quote, he drew only circles, circles upon circles, and it seemed, unfortunately, that this monotonous type of creativity marked the extent of his talent. Doomed to repetition, Vermillon acts as a mirror for the human artists that surround him, who are trapped in academic formalism and derivative pastiche. And the Goncourt's exploration of this theme throughout the novel, I believe, is directly informed by this etching by Jules on the right. Le Singe au Miroir, The Monkey in the Mirror, reproduces a painting by Alexandre Gabriel de Camp that you can see in the middle. And he was the Goncourt's favorite modern artist, and famous for depicting this figure of the monkey artist in several paintings. But in the etching by Jules on the right, you can see that he removes all of these props from the artist studio to focus on the central encounter between monkey and mirror. And this is really a moment of confrontation with the self, just as the Goncourt's artist novel is at its core about their encounter as writers with their alter egos, artists. And the mirror's rectangular framed shape, I think, also looks suspiciously like a painting, calling to mind this mimetic metaphor of art as a mirror for the world. So throughout the novel, the brothers use the presence of monkeys and mirrors to destabilize the boundaries between self and other, imitation and reality. Menat Salomon ostensibly attempts to mirror the reality of their contemporary 19th century world, but their writing constantly undermines this at every turn through humor and irony. And the etching itself is also symbolic of this kind of overdetermined referentiality, because it's likely a copy of a copy. While it's possible that the brothers saw the original painting, it's actually more likely that they copied from this lithograph by Eugène Leroux, rendering their version an artistic copy twice removed. So like Vermillon, are they simply trapped in the same sort of circles of repetition and imitation? And this is where the figure of the monkey artist intersects in a fascinating way with the anxieties of the etching revival around what I call mechanical art. I have this caricature up again here because it brings both together in the same image. We have the monkey artist in the front, and then in the back we have this anthropomorphized pantograph, a mechanical tool for enlarging drawings that's come to life. And the rapid pace of technological innovation in the 19th century resulted in new anxieties about this encroachment of mechanization into the sphere of art. As Gautier trumpeted in his 1862 manifesto for the etching revival, quote, "The Society of Etchers was founded precisely to combat photography, lithography, aquatint, engraving, where the cross-hatching meets at a point in the middle. In a word, repetitive, automatic, uninspired work, which distorts the very idea of artistry." And here there's an implication of something much more insidious than art simply made by mechanical means. Gautier and other critics instead highlight an infection of the creative process by the mechanical in the sense of mindless repetition. Yet what I discovered in a closer reading of Menat Salomon and the Goncourt's numerous journal entries describing their experience with etching is an alternative perspective, that this mechanical repetition is an engrossing, even therapeutic experience, allowing the artist to enter what we might now call a flow state. For example, we have this fabulous description of the artist Coriolis making etchings in the novel. He sought to bury himself in work, in the weariness, the relief of a type of mechanical art. Etching made him forget everything else. It was like a temporary suspension of his life. And we also have this etching by Francis Seymour Hayden on the left, who was a key figure in promoting etching across the Channel in England. that sort of visually enacts the separation between mind and body, focusing entirely on the artist's hands, tools, and the title, The Sweet Solace of Labor. And I think both are really reevaluating artistic labor to focus not on the product, but on the process itself. And Laurel and I are going to talk a little bit further about this very unusual characterization of etching in the discussion. And in the book, Beyond Manette Salomon, I also explore how the brothers' first-hand understanding of etching informed their other novels at the level of style and structure. I look at how their unique prose, écriture artiste, artistic writing, translated elements from etchings by artists like Charles Marion, transforming etched hatch marks into a cumulative syntax, or using the vocabulary of etching to conjure thematic associations. And I also consider how the narrative structure of their novels drew on the same principles behind 19th century print albums, whether the type of collector's portfolios that you can see in this print on the right, or the albums published by the Society of Etchers itself. The Goncourts novels emphasize fragmentation, discontinuity, and juxtaposition, all aspects that link the serial format of the print album with the narratives of their novels. And finally, while the brothers never illustrated their novels with their own prints, I also look at two editions of Germinie Nassauteux and René Mauperin, which were illustrated by two of the most famous etchers of the day, James Tissot and Jean-François Raffaelli. And these illustrated editions demonstrate not only how the brothers' experience with etching shaped their own novels, but also how their novels inspired other print series. So to conclude, I want to finish with a brief peek into the afterlives of the Goncourts etchings. As we've seen, the brothers were equal partners in their written work, but Jules was the much more prolific and talented etcher of the two. So what happened when he tragically died from syphilis at age 40 in 1870? And much has been written about how Edmond orchestrated the brothers' legacy as authors and collectors. However, his role in preserving his brother's work as an etcher offers a fascinating counterpoint. For example, we have this famous portrait of Edmond by Félix Braquemont on the left, and it's typically cited for its presentation of Edmond as a collector. He's surrounded by 18th century and Japanese artworks. Yet Jules is also subtly present in this portrait. In the lower right-hand corner, sort of peeking through the stand, is the cover of this portfolio of his etchings that was published by critic Philippe Berthier. And both Braquemont and Berthier were figureheads of the etching revival. And this is just sort of one example of how Edmond really strategically mobilized this apparatus of the print world to ensure his brother's legacy. But it's also an ambivalent image. Despite being sort of prominently placed in the foreground, the portfolio is obstructed. It's quite hard, you have to be a well-informed viewer to know what you're looking at. So Braquemont is both highlighting and obscuring Jules' presence in this image, I think. And this is really indicative of how Edmond's promotion of his younger brother's etchings was also inextricably linked with his own self-fashioning as an aging author embarking on a solo career. There is this unusual proliferation of portraits after Braquemont's that depict Edmond alongside print portfolios, where the portfolio comes to stand in for Jules and his work as an etcher. But these are again ambiguous images. Are they commemorative, narcissistic? After Jules died, Edmond swore that he would never write again and actually blamed himself for his brother's death, saying that he turned his brother away from art and towards writing, which he believed ultimately caused his death. At the same time, he then went on to publish another 4 solo novels, breaking this creative compact. So when read alongside these novels, Edmond's attempts to promote his brother's etchings really weave a complex web of both grief and guilt. So like the Goncourt brothers themselves, this book aims to cross disciplinary divides, bringing print culture and literature, writing and etching back into the rich dialogue that existed between them in 19th century France. So thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Hey. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Laura.
And hi, everyone. I just want to thank you, Rachel, for giving me the opportunity to read. I imagine I'm one of the few readers of your book so far, and I just want to impress upon the audience how great a contribution it is to print scholarship. And I hope you all get a chance to read it. And Rachel, I think I'm going to pick up on where you sort of just ended up talking about interdisciplinary divides, to ask you a little bit about how you came to this topic. One of the things I find so compelling about the book is the way it sits so beautifully between literary and print studies in a way that's, of course, so suited to the subject at hand. The Goncourts, who you say are, these kind of exceptional writer etchers. But I'm just curious to hear from you a little bit about what it's been like for you to kind of traverse disciplines and what the opportunities and challenges have been for you in approaching this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have to start by thanking, my amazing faculty mentors in the French departments at both Princeton and Oxford, because they really made visible for me the kind of scholarship that can exist at this wonderful intersection between literary scholarship and art history. Um, and I always knew I was interested in that intersection, but I kind of came at this topic sideways. I was looking in my PhD for 19th century authors who were interested in the 18th century, which is also my background, and I was really into the history of collecting. And so I came at the Goncourt's etchings actually looking at those reproductive prints I showed at the beginning that are reproducing artwork in their own collection. And once I discovered that, I was like, wow, why there's been nothing written about these prints. I've got to go deeper. But coming from a literary background, this was incredibly intimidating. I would say, one of the biggest challenges, we're among print lovers and print scholars right now, but print studies can seem incredibly intimidating, with the focus on technique and process. So I think for me, having some practical experience in print rooms, I was really lucky to be doing an internship at the Ashmolean print room while I was at Oxford. And that gave me the grounding, that sort of gave me the confidence to move forward in this area. But I think there's so many opportunities, especially with printmaking and literature, because so much scholarship about the relationship between art and writing in the 19th century focuses entirely on painting. And this was just a huge gap in the scholarship. So I'm really excited to have hopefully sort of kicked off a conversation here. But I do think what's really exciting about it is, being attentive to the specificity of a medium and the fact that, the way authors interacted with prints, even if they weren't necessarily making them like the Goncourt, is very different from the way they would have interacted with paintings. And so following that logic, it should have had a different impact on their writing. And I think that's something that hasn't really been explored.
Thank you. And I guess one more related question there is, I guess how you see the study contributing more specifically to 19th century French print studies, or even within studies on the etching revival, how you see it kind of fitting there.
Yeah, I think there's really a revival of interest in the revival. Sort of over the last 15 or so years now, there have been some incredible exhibitions at art museums in the US. At the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago had a great one. Brittany Salisbury at RISD produced an amazing publication about the etching revival. So it was great for me to have this sort of body of work to build on, and the Goncourt were mentioned in a lot of these exhibitions and catalogs, but I really saw this as an opportunity to do sort of a deep dive into their work, and again, this really unique position that they occupy. So they're both sort of a case study that stands outside the rest, but I think one that can still provide a lot of interest for the larger revival. And then thinking about more recent print scholarship, I think there's been really like a turn towards thinking about process and technique, and how the actions and motions of the printmaking process and the way the body is involved. I'm thinking of Jennifer Roberts' work here, for example. That has, I think, mostly been applied to maybe 20th century or contemporary art. So bringing some of those conceptual approaches to the 19th century as well was really exciting because, the Goncourt really do write about that very firsthand experience. So it's sort of a unique opportunity to draw on that writing.
Well, that leads really beautifully into the next question, which is to really linger on as you mentioned in your presentation, the Goncourts sort of exceptional trove of material that they provide into the etching process, and to maybe make it even more vivid for our audience today, the kinds of terms they use to describe etching coming from their unique position as writer etchers. And I'm hoping that can kind of lead us. I don't know if you want to kind of take that up, but I'm hoping also to talk a little bit more about how that in some ways runs against the grain of other kind of prevailing rhetorics around etching in the moment. And I can kind of maybe discuss with you what that is like.
Yeah, I think this was one of the sort of aha moments for me in this project, was discovering this trove of writing, in their journal, in their diary, because they're such obsessive recorders of experience and sensation, in every aspect. A lot of, TMI really, but an amazing resource for scholars. And previously in literary scholarship, there's been a lot of attention to the way they write about writing and the experience of writing. And that is almost always presented in this incredibly as this torturous, painful process. There are multiple instances where they describe writing a novel like a monstrous birth, which of course was all great for me to read, as I was trying to write this book. And so there was a really interesting contrast with how they wrote about etching, because there they emphasize that it's very hard work, but that it's about patience and diligence and repetition. And all of these terms that are used in a very negative way in the etching revival, I think maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, but they see it in a very positive light, and that it enables them to kind of separate mind and body, to have this sort of physical sensation instead of just a purely intellectual process, which I think writing is a bit more for them. And so I sort of grappled a little bit with this because I wondered, well, does this sort of lead into the argument that like etching was this kind of escape from their writing? It was this, they were copying other artists' work. Was it just this sort of therapeutic process? But actually, when I went back then to their descriptions of writing, I found that their moments where they felt they'd accessed their most like creative state actually had a lot in common with these descriptions of etching, sort of suggesting that it's this kind of automatic, repetitive work that can really allow you to sort of access maybe a higher level of creativity, which I think is something that hasn't come out before in their descriptions of their work and the sort of labor behind it.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I mean, so in some ways, yeah, I found myself, I guess, a little bit surprised by their descriptions. Their, as you say, their kind of attention to the diligence, patient application, the mechanical work. I think they say somewhere it's etching is like making little hatchworks, little worm-like lines with a needle. And how this sits with, again, kind of other writers from the period, most famously probably Baudelaire, who really insist instead on etching as this like totally unmediated, spontaneously intentional means of making images that can move like as quickly from the mind onto the plate as more than any other medium. So one of my favorite descriptions from Maxime Lalande in 1866, he writes, "The great aim in etching is to arrive at the first onset at the realization of our ideas as they are present in our minds. And etching must be virginal, like an improvisation." Or Gautier, who you rely on a lot too, he writes, "No medium is simpler, more direct, more personal than etching," which of course, if you've made an etching, if you're the Goncourts, like, you know, it's not as simple or unmediated as that. But I'm curious, yeah, I guess, to hear a little bit more about what you make of this rhetorical strain or even contradiction in the rhetoric around the revival, and yeah, how the Goncourts sort of sit or don't sit with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love those quotes that you shared, and I put one down as well because there's this amazing quote where the Goncourt brothers are really critiquing this language. It says, this is from March 5th, 1866. I read in an article by Paul de Saint-Victor, quote, "Emotion is what characterizes Seymour Hayden's etchings. Come on now, does one make an etching with emotion? Don't you know what etching is? A diligent man who by the light of an etching frame strains his eyes, scratching at a varnished copper plate, taking care not to put a single hatch mark out of place. In etching, the devil is in the details." So I think they're very aware of this sort of prevailing rhetoric, and I find it kind of funny in a way. Was it like, come on, you know, you haven't actually done this, you don't understand. Um, so, you know, in some ways, I think they're absolutely going against the grain there, and it's a fantastic perspective, I think, to add to this criticism that's been, you know, really looked at and cited. Um, but on the other hand, there are some aspects of this sort of rhetoric around particularly the accessibility, and I would say the sort of transparency of etching that does relate to their work. Um, in that, you know, they are amateurs in, you know, the richness of that term, but they were able to learn it and practice it at home. You know, they would take the plates to be printed with a professional. Um, but etching, you know, it doesn't require that. The actual drawing on the plate doesn't require the same training as, you know, engraving, for example. So there is some truth to that aspect of it that I think, you know, is apparent in their ability to actually practice this art form. And then this question of transparency, there, you know, is a lot of rhetoric around. I think I have a quote from Baudelaire here that says, you know, it would be very difficult for the artist not to convey their most intimate personality through the print. So there's like this sense that, you know, etching can't, I think Gautier says, etching can't lie, and this sort of immediacy. And so I do think that's quite an interesting concept to explore with their reproductive prints, because how can you reconcile the fact that etching is supposedly like always going to reveal the artist's hand when you're actually trying to recreate another artist's work? And I do think this idea of translation comes in there, where there's this sort of, yeah, generative process where you're able to somehow see both artists at work at the same time in a way that maybe you can't with a reproductive technique like engraving, where there's, you know, really systematized ways of making lines that are really impersonal in a way. So I do think there are some connections, but there's a really nice, I think, counter narrative that they bring in.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I find the nuances of it all really interesting, and thank you for drawing them out. I have about two more questions, and there's some really nice ones coming into the Q&A. So I'll just kind of pose mine and then open it up for David to monitor the Q&A. I want to switch gears a little bit to ask a question about gender, and how the Goncourts, I would say, very well-known misogyny relates to their thinking about art, about style, and etching in particular. I think I could pose this another way by asking if if their misogyny actually shapes their treatment of etching at all. Just curious to hear you think about that.
Yeah, you know, I think this is a really important question when dealing with their work. They expressed really overtly misogynist views in their journal, but there's this really then strange paradox or tension that almost all of their novels have a female protagonist. They wrote several really significant biographies of 18th century French women. So there is this sort of constant push and pull between repulsion and fascination. But I do think they provide quite nuanced and sensitive, in some ways, portrayals of women in these written works. And there's been a lot of great research about this. But in terms of their, you know, their relationship with etching in particular, I do think we talked a little bit about how potentially some of the I think for future areas of research, thinking about how some of the language around etching could be coded as feminine, this idea of needlework, working with the etching needle, the fact that they are working in these sort of domestic and interior spaces at home, and how that intersects maybe with the more masculine space of the cabinet de travail, the study, where they're writing. And then I think more generally in the sort of project of the etching revival, um, there's a lot of men talking and writing about men making etchings, and there is kind of this male echo chamber that emerges in France specifically. There are other etching revivals in the UK and the US where women are really central, and that just didn't happen in France. And, I think that would be really interesting to dive into a bit more. Two final thoughts there. I think I showed a couple of images in my slides of women engaging with prints in some way. So you have these like wonderfully fashionably dressed ladies looking into the windows of the Etching Society. You have that print with the woman looking through her print portfolio. And I think there's definitely some work to be done on maybe women were not so much practitioners of etching, but how were they consuming and engaging with prints at this moment that was different from this really predominantly male voices and perspectives that we get. And finally, I just want to highlight two female etchers, I think, who deserve a lot more attention. I was so happy to see in your research, Laurel, Gabrielle Niel is mentioned. She's really one of the only women sort of working in etching at this moment in the 1860s. And then Marie Bracquemont as well. So Félix Bracquemont's wife. She's really known as an impressionist painter, but she did make etchings, and obviously through her husband, she would have been engaging with this moment. And I'm particularly intrigued because she made an etching responding to Germanie Lasserteur, and I have never been able to find an image or an impression. So if somebody on this call can direct me to where I could look more closely at this print, I think something like that would be phenomenal to bring in as a response to the Goncourt's work, maybe in contrast with Raffaelli, for example, who illustrated the same novel.
Thanks. Okay, I will wrap up with one more question. Oh, I see David. Would you like to move on now, David?
No, you go ahead, Laurel.
Okay.
Then I'll take over in a moment.
Okay. Well, I was going to pick up on Gabrielle Niel and Charles Marion here, actually, Rachel, just to hear you think a little bit more about, I mean, obviously the heart of your whole project is an exploration of the relationship between print and prose. And in your presentation and in your book, I'm intrigued by your argument about printmaking's specific or even unique interaction with writing compared to painting. So I think it's interesting that painting has really been prioritized in scholarship about interactions between art and literature in this moment. So it was helpful to hear you kind of surmise why that is. But I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about the particular relationship between print and prose. And maybe this is an opportunity for you to expand a little bit more on the relationship between the Goncourt and the Marion's prints of Paris, etchings of Paris. Or I think there's interest in general, I'm anticipating from the audience, about hearing you talk a little bit about how the novels, structures, their narratives relate to the format and logic of contemporary print albums. Maybe that's a good place to pick up.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those are such great area, really rich areas. I think for Marion in particular, he is, like the name of the Etching Revival and the Goncourt were very interested in his work. They wrote a short story that's sort of a fictionalized version of his life, and then he sort of reappears in different ways in Manette Salomon. In way that sort of he's unnamed, but I think there are very clear references to his prints. So it was really fun to sort of pull those out. And I was thinking for him, in particular, how they might have been responding to his sort of specific technique. And their writing in the chapters where they're engaging with his work is actually quite distinct. So for example, he uses incredible sort of detail, this accumulation of hatch marks. He has really dense line work that creates these really dramatic contrasts between light and shade. And some of that comes through, I think, in the Goncourt. There's this really amazing passage where their syntax becomes like this sort of accumulative, accretive process, imagining them thinking about making these little lines, these little worm-like lines. They're sort of building that into their prose. So there's a lot of sort of close reading of text and image that I do to kind of pull out maybe moments where there's a print that's hovering as a sort of unnamed reference and how that we might see that in the text. And then in terms of structure and the narrative, the Goncourt's novels, I think there's one critic has called it this monstrous proliferation of chapters. They have a really unusual approach to structuring their novels, where their narratives are linear, but they're very disjointed. And you'll have chapters that are like 10 pages long, followed by one that's like one paragraph, and they jump between time and place. And I thought that this had so much in common with the emphasis on the print album at this specific moment in the Etching revival, where the Society of Etchers, um, the Gautier is saying that it has no code other than individualism. Um, the whole point is to kind of juxtapose different artists' styles and see how they can take the same medium and create really different effects. And at the same time, there are artists, the Society of Etchers albums are group albums, multiple artists. They're also artists who are really exploring within their own work the kind of print suite, the print album of just one artist. And in those, I think the ways that narrative comes in are really interesting. It's often quite associative. And I think for the Goncourt, they had so much experience reading prints. They collected these albums, they assembled their own albums as collectors, their own portfolios. And I think there's, you have to think that this informed the way they thought about narrative in their own work.
Thank you both. Fantastic. Rachel and Laurel, if you'll stay on too. We have an awful lot of questions that have come in. And the first one touches on the gender question as well as authorship. And it's the Goncourt brothers were said to be inseparable as adults and never spent more than a day apart until Jules died in 1870. Can you always tell which of them wrote what and drew what, etched what?
Yeah, this was an interesting question for me, in whether we could sort of consider their etchings as a joint project in the same way as we can their writing. In terms of their sort of published work, they apparently, from what we hear from period sources who knew them, they would sort of discuss the overall plan, and then they would go and write separately, and then they would come back together and sort of combine the portions that they'd written into the final version. And then in their journal, you can see, based on the handwriting and the manuscript, who wrote, who like actually recorded each entry. But we have to assume that they were basically doing this together most of the time. Someone would be writing and the other one would be sitting over his shoulder. And I think that's very much the way that they approach their etchings. Jules was much better than Edmond. Edmond was the first to admit that his etchings were not as accomplished. But he would definitely have been there, sort of watching Jules make them and probably talking about it, about the process, going with him to get them printed. So I do think they are a joint effort in that way, even if there's maybe less of Edmond's actual hand than in their written work.
Right. This question is for me, actually. I came across a photo of the Goncourt brothers by the famous early photographer Nadar. Does that mean, and you've touched on this, but does that mean that they embraced that very newest form of replication that is photography?
I would say they definitely did not embrace it personally. They weren't, yeah, they were not. I'm trying to remember. I feel like there's some sort of disparaging remarks about photography, but I think more generally in the etching revival itself, and especially in this question of reproductive printmaking, that photography really emerges as this challenge, right? Like, okay, well, now we can make a perfect reproduction of something. What's the role of this sort of translator, this middleman, the reproductive printmaker. So I do think they're thinking about those photography in that sense and its role in in reproducing art and as another one of these sort of mechanical art forms, it's kind of the specter that's haunting the etching revival.
Joseph Mendez sent this in, and then I'm going to give you a quick follow-up from somebody else that bears on it. Does etching, hope you hit this one under the park, does etching continue to be regarded as mechanical mass production art? Another one, have you made etchings yourself? So why don't you go ahead and address those?
Yes. So I've been really lucky to now go on 2 workshops through the Getty Paper Project, which were intended for early career curators to actually make prints. And this was phenomenal because I got to test all of these claims about how easy etching was by actually doing it myself. And, you know, there is an ease to it. We also tried engraving and that was impossible. So yes, relatively it is easier, but it's still, yeah, I think that gave me a new appreciation for the Goncourt's perspective. And then in terms of whether etching is considered a mechanical or mass-produced art, I don't think it was regarded at that point in the 19th century in that way, and definitely not today. I mean, it's such an incredible art form that involves, so many hands and so much thought at so many different stages. Just to remind everyone, if there are literary people on the call who aren't as familiar with the process, the artist will draw on the copper plate. So there's all the decision making that happens there. Then there's the biting process where it's immersed in acid. Again, so many things can go wrong, and the length of time and the strength of the acid can create all sorts of effects. And then finally, after that, the actual inking and printing of the plate. Laurel has done so much amazing work on Auguste Delattre, this printmaker who really, or this printer and publisher who really sort of revolutionized those final stages. So, yes, there are machines involved and mechanical elements, but there's so much artistry sort of at every stage in the process.
Right, this from Grace Hanselman. Discussion of the monkey painters had me thinking about animality in etching practice. I have lately been researching the concept of the claw as a mark-making implement and the scratch as a mark. And I wonder if the Goncourt has ever engaged with this idea. You did address some of that, but if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, the grief. I'm so happy to hear that someone is working on this because I have had this stored away as like this could be an article idea for so long. So kudos to you if you're going in that direction because the claw mark, the grief, the signature comes through in a lot of Gautier writes about it and the Goncourt write about it as well in terms of writing and like the signature and the style of the author should be apparent like this kind of claw mark. And so yeah, that sort of animal metaphor is really central, I think, to this moment, and there's a lot to say there.
Okay, this question, we have time for just a few more from my friend Florus Rosa de Carvalho. I'm going to do some extra kind of trying to understand the question myself here. How do you feel about the Goncourt brothers reinterpreting their output into etching as it relates to them reinterpreting their output in the phrases of their maison d'un artiste?
Interesting. Okay, I'm trying to get at the center of this question, which the maison d'un artiste is Edmond's sort of magnum opus about the brothers' collection. Actually, Braquemont's print was published to coincide with the publication of the book, and it's sort of this often seen as like summarizing the book in an image. And I do think what's interesting about La Maison d'un Artiste, thinking about the brothers as collectors as well as makers, they were reinterpreting drawings in their own collection through etching. And they were also later in life, Edmond was so involved with kind of curating his collection in the house as a physical space. And there are some really interesting intersections with his Morning of Jules. He actually displays alongside all their, fabulous collection of 18th century art and Japanese art and 19th century art. He has Jules etchings in a very strategic place in the attic. which is Le Grenier. That's like a central part of the book, and it's where his sort of literary circle meets. And so I think it's really interesting that he inserts his brother's prints directly in this like central location in the house and in the book as well. So there's definitely a connection with their collecting there.
Okay, from another friend, Ann Leonard at the Clark Art Institute. She says, thank you for the shout out to the Smart Museum exhibition, which I was involved in. I'm eager to read your book. Did the Goncourt brothers express support for other etchers of the period, whether etching revival figures or reproductive etchers like Jules Jacquemart?
Yes, yeah, they collected work by Jacquemart and oh, I'm totally blanking on which artist. They went to an etcher's studio. Maybe this was after Jules died, but Edmond went several times to another artist's etching studio and was really engaged. You know, they were collectors, they were supporting the society. I think Laurel has a fabulous letter where they actually provided a loan to help establish the society. So yeah, they were definitely engaged, and you know, their journal really records all the sort of amazing social events and dinners that they were at where they were interacting with these artists personally.
Yes, you've also touched on this from David Brenneman. How does Gavarni fit into your work on the Goncourts? And I'd add, why not Daumier?
Mm. This is the one part of the book that I didn't get to talk about in the presentation, but is actually really important because I'm really glad you asked this question. Because Gavarni was this incredibly important figure for the brothers. He was actually this father figure for them. You know, both of their parents died when they were very young. And as this sort of older artist, they really looked up to him. They approached him to work on a magazine that they started like really early on in their career. So he plays this central role early on. And then at the end of their joint career, in the year that Jules is basically dying, they write a biography of Gavarni. And Jules made 15 etchings after works by Gavarni, including that amazing Ex Libris, which is the largest engagement with a single artist out of their etchings. And I imagine if he'd lived that, you know, there might have been more and they would have illustrated this biography. But for them, you know, Gavarni was really kind of both a model and a rival, and there's an interesting tension there because he was known, you know, you asked why not Daumier. What they loved about Gavarni was that he wrote his own captions, and they saw him as a writer as well as an artist, and they got real inspiration from that, but also in a lot of their work, they are kind of trying to rival him and maybe surpass him as writers. So there's a lot to unpack there.
But we're at the end of our time, but there's so many questions that have come in that we're going to stay on for another 2 to 4 minutes. Sharon Polyakin says, any connection to Japanese prints?
This is an area I would have loved to go into more. I think the brothers do start to connect Japanese art, or collect Japanese art together, but it's really Edmond after Jules dies. And so I didn't feel like there was a strong argument to make about how it related to their own printmaking at this moment in the 1860s. But Japanese prints are really central in the sort of aesthetics of them to Edmond's later novels. And there's been some great work on that.
Catherine Sullivan says, with their passion for both literature and etchings, I was surprised they didn't illustrate their own writings. You did talk somewhat about that. Could you elaborate? Catherine Sullivan, curator and head of archive, retired Janet Turner Print Museum, CSU, Chico.
Hi, Catherine. Catherine is my predecessor here. Yes, I know this really surprised me. I really tried to see if there were any projects that, you know, maybe they were thinking about doing an illustrated edition. Again, this might be something where if Jules had lived longer, he might have done it. But after his brother dies, Edmond really focuses on publishing new editions of their novels, and that's where these illustrated editions come in. And there's a quote where he says, like, the best thing for book illustration is etching, basically. And So yeah, the Tissot and the Raffaelli editions, I'll just briefly mention, why they're so interesting. The Raffaelli edition, for example, was only printed in 3 copies. It was commissioned by Paul Gallimard, and it was this really sort of special jewel box object. And then the Tissot edition, Edmond worked really closely with Tissot, and it's incredibly personal for the artist as well because he used his lover, his mistress, as the model for the etchings, and she actually died in the process of making them, which mirrors the sort of tragic story of the novel where the heroine dies. So there are some really interesting aspects to those editions, but yeah, they never illustrated their own novels. I still don't know why.
And lastly, as we all know, Rembrandt etchings were vital to the etching revival. Were the Goncourt brothers much focused on Rembrandt etchings?
Not that definitely did not come through strongly. I'm trying to remember if I remember any instances of this. Rembrandt was incredibly important, to the revival. There are all of these references to Rembrandt, both visually and in writing. So they definitely would have thought about it, but for them, they were much more interested, I think, in etching in the 18th century in France. So for them, they're really thinking about, for example, the influence of Piranesi on artists like Fragonard or Hubert Robert, who spent time in Rome and learned etching from him. So that's more of their interest.
Right. Okay. So I've taken shots of photos of all the questions, and those we didn't get to, I'm going to forward to you, Rachel and Laurel. And in some cases, they're anonymous, so you can't answer those. But perhaps if you have time, you could write to each person if we can provide their email addresses to you. I know you're all very busy. Laurel, do you want to say anything else before we sign off here?
No,
Yeah.
just thank you so much. This has been a really great chat, and I hope everyone gets Rachel's book next month.
Thank you very much to both of you, and very much to Cabell on. And let me just mention that this Friday, if you're in New York, Christie's is having a fundraiser for the IFPDA Foundation with an early preview of prints coming up. And in the blurbs I've read and the print month calendar, I see it talks almost completely about contemporary artists that are coming up for sale, but we did prevail upon them. They were kind enough. They're going to open up and show us some of the great Josephowitz Rembrandts that are going to be for sale later on this season. And so we're going to have the first view of them on Friday night. And as I say, go to the IFPDA print month calendar if you wish to subscribe to that, an in-person cocktail party. Thank you, Christie's, and thank you all for attending today. This is the IFPDA in New York, signing off.